Right, talk today briefly about a selection of Tasmania, um, and just for those of you who don't know, though I expect most of you do, you've heard me say it often enough. Tasmania is the island state of Australia. It's about the size of Ireland or Wales, and they often refer to mainland Australia as the Big Island, which indeed it is. What I'm going to do now is show you first some postal history, then some stamps, and then some revenues. And I hope I'll take no more than about half an hour. The postal history begins with some pre-stamped material, and it shows one or two early stamp covers. But before we start all of that, no Tasmania postal history collection is complete without having a Hobart Town Gazette. Why is it there? Because it's got a duty stamp on it. And why is the duty stamp there? It's because the governor got fed up with some of the things that were being said about him in the Hobart Town Gazette. So he put a 2p a sheet tax on it to try and make them come into line. It didn't last for very long, about 6 months. I guess he must have either turned happy or they decided to humour the gentleman. So on to some real postal history. There are some extremely scarce and extremely expensive letters which have no markings at all. When I start with the first type of cancel, which basically is a circular stamp with the name of the place in it. There are only 3 types. I show you a Hobart one. There's Hobart, Launceston and Georgetown. And in total, there are less than 25 of the examples that exist. I have a Hobart, I have a Launceston. I almost had a Georgetown. I was delighted one day, a lot of years ago now, when I came home and found that there was a Georgetown for sale on eBay as a buy it now for a mere $2,000 Australian. It may sound like a lot of money, but in the context, it was dirt cheap, I assure you. Anyway, I tried to buy it now and was told it had been withdrawn from sale. On inquiring a bit more about it, I found that it had been withdrawn from sale because somebody had alleged that the seller had stolen it from the colony archives. This was not true, but he is said to have been so disgusted that he took it off sale, and when it was took it away and he destroyed it. So there are now, as far as I know, only 2 examples of Georgetown instead of the 3 that there were at one time. I have been offered one, but just to put things in context about the price, the one I was offered, I could have it for what the owner paid for it, because he had both of them, and it only cost him 19,000 quid. I said, thank you, but no thank you. So this was a letter to England, and you can see its arrival in England on the Portsmouth ship letter. And the ship it went on was the Skelton, September the 2nd, 1820. So you can actually date it. After a while, they did actually adopt other markings, and they had some dated markings. There was a short-lived double ring circle, which usually has a poor impression, but the first real dated cancel was this crowned circle inscribed Hobart Town, VDL for Van Diemen's Land, which was the name of the colony at the time, and that's from 1837. And this is a letter to North Britain or Scotland, and you can see they've paid the halfpenny wheel tax as it's gone over the border. The distance mark, sixpence prepaid, which is the 6 in red, and the 2 and 8 is the mileage rate in England. These lasted for quite some time, but they evolved. The first ones were in black, but then they produced them in red. And there's an example of a slightly later cover, 1843. As was often the case in those days, it's got lots of writing from the recipient on the front, but it doesn't alter the fact that it has appropriate markings for 8pence for the ship letter, and I think it's 1 and 4, which is the mileage to Belfast. I can't remember where the ship, which ship landed that one, but it's unusual. The first two things I actually show you, one is to Scotland and the other is to the province of Northern Ireland. Now, not only did they have letters outside, but fairly early on, they developed town letters. Town letters were done in both Hobart and Launceston. In both places, they had collections at 10 o'clock, 1 o'clock, and 4 o'clock. And there are hand stamps for the each one of these times. This is a Hobart one, and it's interesting because it was rated 2pence, which was the price for a town letter, and that was to be paid by the recipient. However, this one was put in the 10 o'clock post, but the postmaster said out of the delivery because Lansdowne Crescent, which is where it's addressed to, is actually out of the delivery area in Hobart. And to the best of my knowledge, this is the only entire one of these which exists. It has the circular stamp on the back, which says this is a country letter rather than a town letter. There is another one that exists, but it was, unfortunately, it had been torn into 4 pieces. Very sad. Now, as the system developed, they also developed a straightforward numeral cancellation system for all the towns. The first set of numbers was between 10 and 75. Number 10 was Avocar. They were done actually alphabetically, except that Hobart was entirely different, and so was Launceston. Launceston had 5960. Hobart had 61, 2, 3, and 4, and also acquired a 74 later, as I think one of the other ones got damaged and couldn't be used any longer. And that is a typical letter going from Hobart to Launceston in 53. Now, one of the rules of the postal system was that the out, if you like, before the numeral cancellers, they all had to write the name of the post office on every letter. Some of them got rather fed up with this, and they decided that they would make their own hand stamps. And the one I show you is an example of the Campbell hand stamp. It's actually the second type. They had a first one, which is C''town with a date, and this is the third one, the original having been a manuscript. And this one, if you can find enough of them, apparently you can collect the different fonts in the date stamps on them. So it's an example, and there are quite a number of places where postmasters decided that they would invent their own hand stamps until such time as they got one of the numeral date stamps. The letter is of extra interest because it's from correspondence to John Leake Esquire, and if you look at the letters carefully, you can see it says MLC, Member of the Legislative Council, I suppose the local equivalent of an MP. And we are very fortunate in that all of the family's correspondence was kept and collected. So the Leake correspondence, and there's another one which you'll come across perhaps later called the Smith correspondence. But there's a private postmaster's hand stamp from Campbelltown. So that's the end of the first little bit about the early postal history. A little bit now about the pictorial issues. There are 8 stamps only in the set, and I shall only show bits of the penny, but I'll tell you about the other ones briefly. Just so you can see all the stamps, that's what I would call the nearest you get to a first day cover. It shows all 8 stamps from a halfpenny to the 6pence, and it was cancelled on the first day that they were available, which is, can't remember now, something the 28th, 1899. That cover is one of at least 5 that existed, but as far as we know, and we know that because they were all registered with consecutive numbers to the same address, but unfortunately over the years at least 2 of the 5 have disappeared. Now the stamp I'm going to talk to you about is the 1 penny red there, and the stamps were first printed in England. And that's an example which shows the top right hand corner of an imperforate sheet, which some chap you may have heard of called Robson Lowe found in 1966. It was sold out into the trade, and it was cut up into bits, but I'm fortunate enough to acquire at some stage or another the top right hand corner of this imperforate sheet. They were printed by De La Rue in London, nicely engraved, and they were on paper with a watermark TAS, T-A-S, because by then its name had changed. Now, the Tasmanians wanted to take control of their own destiny. So what they did was they insisted that the plates be sent out to the colony so they could do their own printing. However, they couldn't do the engraved printings, so they actually transferred the plates onto lithographic stones and printed them locally by lithography. When they transferred the plates for the penny, one of the major problems they had with plate 1 was that the top right-hand stamp in the plate developed this volcano flaw. And you see there's a little plume coming out of the volcano. Now the stamp shows Mount Wellington, which is an entirely dormant volcano, and it's very clear why they call it the volcano flaw. However, they're a thrifty lot, so they decided they were going to retouch it. And as you will see from those examples there, they made a really rather nasty, dirty mess by the time they'd retouched it about 3 times. And eventually they gave up on that first plate and printed some other plates. Right, now a little bit more about these because they're fun to collect. Why are they interesting? Because these stamps all 8 of them, were used in the colony from 1899 in one form or another right through until 1912. They were printed locally, but they first used lithographic printings on their own paper, and it wasn't really their own paper because they had them printed in Victoria, so it was printed on V over Crown paper. And then a little bit later on, after the Commonwealth of Australia, they printed them on Crown over A paper. So there's 3 different papers to consider. But the great fun comes with the printing methods, because first they were printed by line engraving, then they were printed by lithography, and then they were printed using electrotype. And finally, they printed the penny, the tuppenny, which is this one down in the left-hand corner, by stereotype method. But that was the only one printed in that way. But the greatest fun for the collector, and the most visible thing, is the fun they had with perforations. I've mentioned that the Tasmanians were thrifty, and as part of the quality control in Victoria, they checked to see if they'd missed any rows of printing, any rows of, perforation. And any row of perforation that they missed, they perforated with the first perforating machine to hand. Well, they had 2 that they used, one perf 11 and the other perf 12.5. And they picked up most of the missing perforation lines that way. But it does mean you do get mixed perforations on some sheets. However, when the sheets were sent to Tasmania, they did a further quality control check. And the stamps, they found, oh, we've missed 1 or 2 here or there, and they ended up perforating them themselves, and they had a machine which was perf 12. So there are 3 different types of perforation, and you can get all sorts of interesting combinations. So there's plenty to collect with those. I have a fair collection of those, but I recently, having seen the absolutely superb one by my friend Malcolm Groom, I've given up on doing an exhibit of it, because I think it is just so much better and it can never be beaten. So on to the next bit, the Platypus Fiscals. These are actually remarkable stamps because they were used for both fiscal and postage purposes. They were introduced as fiscals in their own right in 1880 and replaced earlier George and Dragon design stamps. But in 1882 they became valid for postage, and they were valid for postage until 1900. As revenue stamps, they were withdrawn in 1903, but the thrifty Tasmanians put the plates into the strong room, and they reintroduced them in 1930 for something called wages tax, which I think you and I would view as income tax. I'll do a brief description of each of these, and there are many, many types of overprint with all sorts of varieties you can get on them. But the original sketch for the central design and the original sketch for the stamp, these used to belong to Francis Kiddle, and when I went to the Kiddle sale, it was the one thing I was determined to come home with. And as you can see, I did. A die proof of the stamp, which doesn't appear to have come up very well in my scanning because the focus is not too good. And something which you don't see very often, and something I acquired from the Rue Archives, is the ink recipes for the 6penny and the shilling Tasmanian platypus stamps. Now, they're used for postal and fiscal purposes. And just an example here, here is a bill of exchange from a lady to whom we are very thankful, called Mrs. Maria Kissock, because she kept all her bills of exchange from the Mount Bischoff Mining Company. And there's one with threepence and a 1 shilling duty stamp on them, plus a half-crown Georgian dragon. But they were all sent in an envelope paying the 6p rate for the long sea route to England with a 6p Platypus revenue stamp, or revenue come postage stamp, because it's 1888, and so it was there to be there could be used for postage. I'm very grateful in this lot for the late Trevor Davis, who was kind enough to let me have first dibs at a large selection of these that he bought in America. At the end of the 1900, they overprinted these stamps revenue, and they thought that would be enough to stop them being used for postage, but it wasn't. They actually had to do a separate rule and put it into law, so that from the 30th of November 1900, they were no longer available for postage, only available for revenue. There's a block of 9, and the colour reproduction of that is rather poor. It looks black, it is actually a slate blue. Now, some examples here of the revenue overprints. One here, which is used on the 30th of November 1900, a block of 4, but you do get varieties. There are those who say these are printer's waste. Double overprint here, with one being vertical, and they obviously use them because they've still got fiscal or postal cancellations on them. And something which I have a block of 4 with a treble overprint on 2 stamps. Because of the register, the means it will exactly fit onto those stamps. And if you like, if you want to see a philatelic cover, then there's a real philatelic cover for you, because it's the last day of use, and there's a whole load of these revenues used on the last day. I mean, 3 shillings postage for a local letter, it's definitely a philatelic item. This is fiscal use, a nice lot of them used there. And actually, I have a use of these revenue stamps for postage due. Most unusual. I was told by a colleague in Tasmania that he had an unusual thing which had 14 of these threepennies used to pay postage due on a cover, and it had an interesting instructional marking on it. To cut a long story short, I persuaded him it belonged in my collection, and money changed hands for it. But I say they're thrifty. They had too many of the threepennies, so they surcharged them. And there are 3 types you see on the first lot of surcharging. An ordinary penny, a narrow penny because they didn't quite have enough ones for the setting, and one with a slanted top. And you do get those in tet beige pairs, and you get the overprint inverted. But in the second printing, they got their act together a bit better, and they got them, although they're different types of 1, you do actually get them all the same way up. Now, there's a different style, like this one down at the bottom, and there were 2 sheets and 2 mint singles recorded. I now know that's slightly out of date. the sheet, there is one complete sheet which belongs to my friend Dave Ellsmore in Queensland, and I have a block of 4 of mint singles, all right, 2 blocks of 4 mint singles, which I bought off him because he broke up the second sheet. However, that is still the only recorded used copy. Those were withdrawn in 1903 and replaced by a rather boring set of revenue stamps which featured a numeral of value. However, as I mentioned earlier, in 1930 they introduced wages tax, which is income tax, had to be paid by stamps on a worksheet, and they reprinted the penny and the 9pence in 2 different forms, like one with 9 pence on it, another one with a 9D overprint, and a 7 and 6pence, and they ran out of the 9 pennies, so they printed some more in brown, and they excuse me, overprinted them 9D, and these lasted for quite a while. And here's an example of use on actually paying stamp duty, and it's got a Perfin for it because it's got LLG of the Perfin for the Liverpool, London and Globe Insurance Company. And just to finish this first bit, in 1892, the Tasmania had a set of tablet stamps, a common design as used by De La Rue, but they had £250,000 £1 stamps delivered. You think how much £1 was worth in 1892? It was rather an oversupply. Excuse me. And so they overprinted them for revenue, but that still didn't use up enough. So they then did various other overprints, but actually the revenue use continued until I think in the 1950s. So they overprinted them revenue, first as a hand stamp, then straightforward revenue like the other stamps. And then in 1917, they overprinted them 1 shilling because they were short of shilling revenue stamps. And then in 1918, they overprinted some more 5D. And this still didn't manage to use them up. Getting these used on bills is actually quite difficult. The shilling is very difficult, but the 5D is available. And something which, to finish with, which I think is, it must have the other half of the top of the sheet, but that's double overprint of the shilling on the £1 revenue. Now I've had that for what, 20, 30 years, so I didn't pay a lot of money for it. There must be the other half somewhere, but I have never seen another one, and I have never seen a used one. Now it says end of the first half, but you can breathe a sigh of relief because that's the end of what you're going to get today. I hope I haven't talked too long. I said about half an hour, and that's it. Thank you very much for your attention.